The two wolf children had not been allowed into Crawler's City for a good reason. The Ratkin had been very, very busy. Their numbers had increased daily in the years since the tragedy of 2021, when Crawler had, at last, after some 140 years in hiding, appeared from the wreckage of the new nightmare world and began his own recruitment. He had not always been as he appeared to Bill and Rodney. In fact, his physical changes had only begun in the months leading up to the fateful Halloween night of the horrifying poisoning of the world's Samhain players. Until then, he had roamed the back alleys of man's world as a vagrant and professional outsider, followed and ennobled by an army of rodents, which he had originally regarded as a repugnant curse, but in time had grown to accept as a community to which he belonged by some turn of the cosmic wheel. He had studied the vermin carefully during the first decade of his escape into the sewers of Paris, and found that this was no normal breed of black Norway rats. The creatures were intensely cunning and fiercely aggressive, with no notable fears of men or their society. They were masters of survival and thievery, traits which he soon found himself acquiring in ever-increasing degrees. He had finally initially attempted reintegration into man's society with disastrous results, as his saviors would never leave his presence. The melancholy of finding himself their prisoner had driven him into the depths of despair he would never have dreamed possible. But over time, as he watched the Europe of his past evolve into a battlefield not only once, but twice, he found his longing to live amongst his fellow men fading. He had watched the formation of racist socialist regimes in many of his beloved European countries with revulsion and disdain. The concept of a pure race, a joke if there ever was one, became an actual accepted philosophical belief which turned into a wretched and evil religion for many of the German people. The ideas of the libertine and the poet were lost in the roar of machines and the thunder of bombs as children were butchered by the long knives of the Nazis. Paul Fournier watched and compared the world of men with the world of rats, and found men wanting. Rats were competitive and often brutal, but men could, with the turn of a phrase, decide to exact genocide against entire societies, only for the dream of power. He had wandered battlefields and concentration camps, weeping at the rivers of blood spilled to satiate a hideous dream of extermination and conquest. He had thought then that he was witnessing the apocalypse foretold in his nightmares, but in time he would awaken screaming with the knowledge that there was yet to be another. He had left Europe in the late 1940s and found himself wandering the American continent, which had proved, at least for the time, to be to his liking. He had witnessed the birth of a new generation, the beatniks, with affection for the rebirth of poetry amongst their ranks. The post-war American youth were subtle and dark with their rhythms and words of exploration and separation from the mainstream. The American history books declared the country as the world's hero and the destroyer of the Nazi occupations, while denying all along that a blind eye had been turned as a dictator nearly terminated one of the planet's oldest and most sacred of cultures. It was forgotten that the word eugenics had been uttered by countless government officials and scientists in the pre-Nazi era. These truths were not lost upon the young, however, and in time strong voices emerged proclaiming the sanctity of the free mind with its ability to discern the deception and corrupt power's ongoing propaganda. Yet again, however, the Kerouacs and the Ginsbergs of the world would be ignored, and more wars would come. This time, in the very name of freedom against the philosophy of communism, America began to protect freedom with war. And that was when Paul left and retreated into the north of the continent, into Canada. He had longed to hide in the wild, but by their very nature his rats loved cities, full of bustling, mindless society. It was during this time that he was forced to accept that he was no Pied Piper. Instead, it was he who followed them. just as they were following the spirit they shared, the Lord behind the wall. Paul had kept up with the times, as his nature, like the rats, was adaptive. He had mastered the intricacies of the computer age with ease, and within his den, in an abandoned apartment building basement, he had witnessed the growing onset of a world bent on destruction from behind numerous keyboards and monitors he had collected and upgraded to a degree of technology any hacker would find not only impressive, but mind-boggling. It had become his pastime to delve far into the coded files of the military world governments and uncover one conspiracy after another, while exposing these secrets with glee on the World Wide Web. He had, in fact, quite unintentionally, become the keystone of a complex network of underground computer experts, whose goals ranged from outing the illicit dealings of the politicians all the way to the inception of world anarchy. It had been during these investigations that his intense curiosity had awarded him access to a group of hackers whose goals were so hidden and misleading that upon discovering their agenda, he became enraged. He had, over the course of years, watched the Samhain online game grow from its infancy into a disturbing and corruptive influence over the minds of its players. But still, he had not guessed the level of the game's malignancy. He had taken to ignoring the numerous apparitions he encountered during the daily cycle of his existence, and now felt shame that he had not listened when the wandering shades had foretold a coming disaster unlike any the world had seen. Ghosts were often confused, paranoid, and bitter, so it was easy to plug his ears with headsets and drown out their ongoing banter with the loud electronica he had become so fond of in the past age. To his own personal embarrassment, he had taken as much by surprise as anyone when the Serpent Dead had first appeared. However, he had long lived as an exile from the world of men, and his residence was by then a labyrinthine fortress in which he had silently waited out the tragedy which scourged the surface world. He had watched his own physical transformation with mild amusement, and pondered its relation to the events unfolding above with curiosity. It had been in the months following the upheaval that he had begun to contemplate exactly what his next move would be after the demise of men. It had been just after that he had finally ventured out from his subterranean lair that he became conscious of a new and interesting piece in the puzzle of his fate. There were survivors. He had first tried to ignore his own feelings of pity towards the hiding pockets of humans who he encountered struggling to fight against the onslaught of venomous, hungry monsters. In time, however, he could not repress his own guilt at leaving them to die in the twisted hunting ground of the city streets. He despised death in all its incarnations, and had finally arrived at the conclusion that he had to act in defense of the species which had originally given him life. It had been then that he had offered to those he encountered the only gift he had to offer, sanctuary. So he had opened his home to those who were desperate enough to trust a hybrid creature that lived in the underground. To his surprise, there had been many, and in time the numbers of his refugees outgrew the limitations of his tunnels and basements. It was as the members of his group began to undergo changes much like his own that they had expanded the borders of the Rat Kingdom to neighboring towns and settlements. If the two young hybrid wolfmen had known that they may not have so willingly shared the vital piece of technology which would become so important to Crawler's plans. It seemed to Crawler that he had watched human governments and systems of belief grow and fail with disastrous consequences to the living natural world. The question remained, what would he do with this chance to rebuild a new society? Each form of government and religion had begun with some beautiful concept of man's freedom and spirituality, only to be taken, twisted, and used by an individual's personal lust for domination. The ideas of socialism and communism had been born from the dreams of the downtrodden of a world where wealth, power, and responsibility were shared by every member of society. Democracy and capitalism had mirrored those desires with the ideas that the people should have the inherent power to govern themselves and succeed beyond the restraints of class or race. The problem remained how to keep one person or group from gaining leverage over all the others. The question was one he had asked himself in all his years watching the machine of man's civilization devour the earth. To his continued frustration, he still had no real answer other than the one fate had delivered. Government took a far drop in priority in a world where survival was the only ongoing goal. Despite his lifetime of cynicism of those who had held power, he had become the leader of his growing society, the Ratkin, and he could only hope that he could manage some degree of wisdom in his responsibility to his followers. "So what do you think?" Crawler said, leaning over Nasher's shoulder as her long, deft, clawed fingers typed away at the keyboard in the small, lamp-lit underground compartment. "I think that this Jesse Rose guy was a certified genius," she replied with glee, as she studied file after file that they were currently downloading from the network they had accessed through the communication device. "Is their network compatible with ours? Can it go to satellite?" He set it up to run off of these Wi-Fi nodes if the web shut down, but he had it fully prepped to go to satellite if the possibility arose. So we could link with their network if we so choose, but it would leave our system completely open to them. Nasher looked at Crawler questioningly, with her abnormally large brown eyes, but still attractive, mostly human face. She wore her straight black hair long on top, but had the sides of her head shaven to reveal large, rodent-like ears. "The shamans and the two wolf boys have been lost for days, according to what I have overheard on the device. If we put them online with our satellite, we could find them on GPS and help, correct?" Crawler asked as he stroked the long hairs of his chin. "Yes, but we can make ourselves that vulnerable. How do we know we can trust these American wolves?" Nasher said without contempt, knowing better than to take a tone of judgment when discussing Crawler's plans. "I am not playing at intrigues, Nasher. Those are the games of men, not ours. We will do what we feel is best for all living things. These wolves are part of the same cycles and struggle as we are, and I will not allow such potentially powerful allies to perish if I can preserve their existence. We are not here to let others die, because they are not the same as us. I believe that their agenda is much like our own. They seek only to rescue and protect. But what about this skull book? Is there anything to it?" Nasher said, perusing the files as the soft tone of a violin began playing behind her. This signaled that Crawler was now deep in thought, and she would have no choice but to wait for an answer. She began reading a section from the book entitled "The Nature of Impermanent Spheres." So, unbound by the restraint of natural laws, reality becomes a transient vision of that entity which hosts the sphere. The memories of those within it can no more be trusted as true than the meandering path of a dream. Within the sphere's territory, things and beings can spontaneously be projected into reality, complete with history and a seemingly grounded role within its surroundings. Just as she began to absorb what she had read, the music abruptly ended, and Crawler began speaking. "Everything I have read in this book seems to directly apply to our current situation. If this text is in fact authentic, then it is not only ahead of its own time, but ahead of ours. It has given me an understanding of my condition which I never would have reached on my own, and for this I owe those two a debt of gratitude. All I knew before was from the dialogue of spirits which themselves I did not truly understand. Now I confess that I am as baffled and confused as ever to what the proper course of action should be, except that it will involve these American wolves. So, Do you mean to tell them about the others? She asked, turning in her chair to study his calm, animal-like features. In time. But what would I do? Announce on their network that there is a bear shaman in Siberia, a bat shaman in Colombia, and a lizard priest in Australia, amongst others we do not even know of. I will put them online and let the cards be dealt as they are. Right now, I need more information. I need to understand these gateways, and if it is possible for us to use them while still alive without causing some manifold destruction. The book says that only the dead may travel, but fails to explain the consequences if those such as us should pass through one of these anomalies. I have the same reservations as you, Nesha. What will they do when they find out that we have ships and planes at our disposal? How will they react if they should guess my intentions are not to rebuild this world, but to abandon it altogether? If I am to understand what the book explains, then we currently inhabit a sphere that has been encompassed by the energies of the snake god, and there is still the question of exactly what is occurring in the southern United States. If there is actually a vortex there, then is it possible for us to use it? Can I ask you a question? Nasher said, as she fiddled nervously with the dozens of keychains which she wore beneath her long coat. She had developed an obsession with collecting keys soon after her rescue by crawlers some 3 years previous. Also, her small personal bunk was filled with over 100 MP3 players, which she hoarded passionately. The Ratkin all shared some instinctual need to hoard some object or another. Yes. What would you like to ask? Crawler placed his violin on the desktop and eyed her with interest. You have never really spoken about exactly how all this began for you. You mentioned your condition, and we have all wondered how you came to be in this state. If you truly wish to hear, then I will tell. I will keep no secrets from my people, but you must realize that this is very painful for me to recall these things. It was not a happy time for me, and my life was filled with despair for most of those years. However, I do remember those days vividly, and I will willingly recount the tale to you as long as you will listen closely so as there is no need for me to repeat it again. Nasher nodded her consent solemnly as she left the computer chair and found a more comfortable spot on the ragged couch by the kerosene lantern. Seating himself at the computer, Crawler typed for a moment and brought to the screen the picture of himself he had found filed in the Wolves network. I was only 18 years old when this picture was taken. A mere child, I realize now. The world was so different, and yet very much the same. I had lived in Paris for 2 years. I had lived in Paris for 2 years, in a long, continuous state of intoxication. Not just the intoxication of absinthe, wine, and opium, but also with the intoxication of the time. I was drunk with freedom and rebellion. There was no better place for the artist and the poet than Paris. This was the mythical Paris, of which historians dream of when they fantasize of displacing to another time. I was a vagrant in a paradise of cafes, alleys, and long muddy streets. Here, I penned the shattered images of my soul to paper, and those words were read and discussed over crowded tables in smoky, loud dance halls. Everywhere people talked and shouted over beliefs and philosophies as tortured artists ecstatically painted and wrote in the corners of the rooms and streets of the city. It was all so beautiful, and it was all coming to an end. I spent my days writing and wandering, and my evenings playing music for whatever money I could earn. I slept in a different bed every night and rejoiced in my ever-growing reputation as a wicked devil from the country. If I had been a saner, more rational boy, then I would have known that the Prussian army was coming to invade, but I had paid no attention to such things. I could not have imagined that anything worldly would dare bring an end to my paradise. I awakened one morning to find that all of Paris was in distress as the Prussians had blockaded the city. So oblivious was I to the harsh truths of reality that I had no concept that life in the city was about to change. As the months passed and the fighting continued, food ran short, and the civilian population took to eating whatever they could find: dogs, cats, and even rats, when a common staple in restaurants and cafes. By midwinter, the people were starving and irrational. And there I was, stumbling blind drunk down an alley with no party to attend, and no warm lover's bed in which to fall. It was there that I was confronted by 3 Prussian soldiers as they patrolled the streets, having just declared victory in a week previous. I was mocked and pushed into the muddy snow, where I attempted to get away, scrambling on my hands and knees, and they were laughing and speaking in German, which I barely understood, but for one word: crawler. I will not go into detail, but to say that I was beaten, raped, and left for dead in the filth of the alley. And as I lay there, I hoped partly to be saved, but mostly I wished only to die. It was then, as I gave up all hope and embraced despair, that I saw the small black forms scurrying from the shadows towards me. In my drunken daze, I envisioned being devoured by the starving rats in a long, excruciating death, a punishment for my wickedness and sin. I fancied that I had somehow managed to stumble from paradise and across some hidden bridge into hell. However, you will never understand the singularly astonishing revelation that fell over me when the horrid animals piled atop my broken body, and by some absurd joke of Lady Fortuna, formed a thick blanket to keep me from freezing in the cold. I awakened the next morning, honestly surprised to find myself still there. I was alone. The shroud of rats I remembered only through a foggy haze. I rationalized as a nightmare induced by the trauma of my attack. I was changed in so many ways after that night. My mind was a broken lens through which images were now twisted and distorted with horrible thick darkness. I dragged myself to my feet and made my way through the streets to a friend's home, where I hid for the next few weeks, much to his wife's resentment. From the memory of what had occurred, it was then that I began writing obsessively the long series of poems for which I am remembered. I was very ill, and my refusal of food and inability to sleep without being tortured by nightmares only increased the ongoing sickness. Secretly, I feared I had contracted some wretched disease from my attackers, but I would never speak of those events, even to my closest confidants. There were nights when I sat racked with fever beside the fire, scribbling endlessly of the dark and horrific images which were erupting from my poor, shattered brain. At some point, I became incoherent, and my friend's concern was finally overmatched by his wife's fears that I had gone mad. I cannot truly recall the day I was taken away, but it was a tribute to my friend's loyalty that he collected my writings and later had them published shortly after my disappearance from man's history. I could describe to you in detail the horrors of such a place, but it would be pointless except for me to mention that, as Paris was regaining its freedom, so was I. For some time, many decades in fact, I tried to pretend that I could return to being the Paul Fournier I was before. I roamed the countryside and made my way to other countries. I never wrote poetry again, but I would make my way playing music in orchestras and in taverns. I had been such a social creature that I could not help but make acquaintances and attend events. However, I had new comrades in my travels, and they did not blend so well with high society. Those black-furred beasts who had been my saviors now seemed to think that I owed them my life. I could understand their needs and wants as well as if they were my own, and they demanded that I leave such frivolities as normal human life behind. I, of course, resisted until time, my own desire for such an existence waned. One important influence in this gradual change of temperament was the now ever-present appearances of the dead. I know that you, among my kin, can now sense these apparitions and sometimes glimpse them in the dim twilight where they wander. But let it be known that to me they are as real and invasive as any other living entity could be. Heed my warning. If they should ever become as clear to you as they are to me, do not let them know you see them. If that book is correct about anything, it is that the vast majority of these wayward spirits are as far from enlightenment as a burrowing worm is from the sun. Many cannot understand what and where they are, and to the countless bitter souls wrought with religious disappointment, as are as many as the sand upon the beach. And yet there are those who move on, and yet it is now clear to me that it may be as simple as realizing that they may indeed travel, not from place to place, but world to world, and time to times past. Still, you must watch for these twisted ancient ghost who has some hidden in some ruined building, believing it has been judged unworthy of some great reward from an unjust God. I have encountered many of those hungry ghosts and can only tell you to steer a wide path from their awareness. Trapped one night by a storm in an old Swedish farmhouse, I found myself screaming at such a spectre. "You can be reborn, fool! Find some distant relation about to marry and await a pregnancy!" But this reasoning was lost to this mad ghost of a turn-of-a-century farmhand. He had slept with the daughter of his employer before being trampled by a bull, and was certain that this purgatory was his penance. However, there also was the ghost of a poor child, dead of consumption, who I gently urged to follow her family until a time came for a birth. I told her that it was easier to rejoin into the same family to which she had been previously born. I told her to keep speaking to her parents and tell them she was there, even if it seemed like they could not hear. When I passed through the village 2 months later, the girl's spirit was gone, but her mother was with child. 9 months later, a healthy baby boy was born with golden hair like the little spirit I had seen. I would not hesitate to suggest to the living that there is no evil in moving on with life in the face of death. For sometimes the dead await your mourning to end more than even yourself. And so, I must heed my own advice, Nasha. This world is festering with death, and we must carry on. We must find a way out so that we can begin anew. And I feel that this goal may only be accomplished with the help of the wolf shamans and their gifted friends. Tell the others to uplink our system with their network. The American wolves are going online now. They will be very curious, I am sure, and have many questions. I would appreciate it if you would represent me in tonight's communications, as all this remembering has left me sad and tired. As you wish, Crawler. I think the others felt it was the right thing to do as well. Yes, they are all good people. They deserve better than the snake pit in which to raise their ratlings. Standing, Crawler walked to his private bedchamber, a small room with a cot, overcrowded with books and various knickknacks. He lay down, and as Nasher left, wondered why all this had fallen upon a reckless teenage poet who had sought nothing more than art and decadence. The creatures were landing on the roof of the barn as if drawn by some innate intuition that they were trapped inside. Sheldon growled and barked fiercely as the fur on his back bristled. Rodney and Bill, who had gone colorblind years previous, were spared the unnerving flashes of multicolored lightning as boards began being ripped from the walls around them. Rodney began firing massive, armor-piercing rounds at the things as their deformed, human-like faces began to peer in through the holes in the rotted wood. Barb checked her extended clip before locking it into her AK-47 and launching a volley of automatic fire in waves around their huddled group. Bill withdrew his machetes and assumed a defensive posture, his eyes blazing red as he prepared for the assembled horde which would soon breach the barn doors. Dylan stood calmly in the center and crossed his arms over his chest as he began to summon the red fire building within him. They watched as the doors were incinerated as if from a bomb blast from outside, but instead of an army of monstrosities, they were confronted by the floating corpse of a teenage boy, which levitated 3 feet above the straw of the floor before them. "The Shadow Walker," Barb whispered, as she tried to contain her fear at the sight of the pale, wounded body which bled endlessly as if wounded but moments before. "Where is the Naga?" came the hollow, echoing chorus of voices from the open, unmoving mouth. "Not here, man. Leave a message. If we see him, we'll let you know you're looking for him," Bill growled from where he stood protectively at the front of the group, trying to keep his clawed hands from quivering with terror. "Where is the Naga?" the ruined thing repeated, as its head lifted and revealed empty, bleeding wounds where its eyes had been in life. As they watched, millions of insects began crawling in through the door and cracks in the walls of the barn. "We don't know where the sorcerer went. No one has seen him in a year," Barb screamed as giant ants, bizarre spiked beetles, and green things which looked like walking, hissing tree limbs came closer to their circle. Sheldon bared his white fangs and growled with rage as the army enclosed them. Then perish," it said with ultimate finality. It was then that Rodney took the beeping communicator from where it lay in a holster on his belt. Quickly entering a code, he stared, astonished, as a small video screen lit up, and he read the words which appeared instantly in the text at the bottom. Holy shit! We've got GPS, guys! What? Barb said, taking his arm and pulling it forward to see the screen. Crawler somehow has uplinked our network to an operating satellite. Several, actually. We're only a mile from the Boot Heel compound. Then let's go, Dylan said, as he opened his cold blue eyes, raised his hands, now encompassed in tendrils of lashing red fire above his head. Bill smiled savagely as he backed away from the front, saying, Sorry, dude, it's been real, but we've got places to go. They watched as the flames built into a fiery red orb between Dylan's clawed hands, which in one quick motion he threw to the floor of the barn, creating a solid shockwave of red light, which spread out in an ever-growing dome. Every creature the light touched was immediately disintegrated until the wall hit the Shadow Walker with the force of a hurricane gale force wind and pushed the floating corpse backwards through the doors and into the storm. Which way? Bill asked Rodney, who pointed to the back wall of the barn. Without another word, Bill ran at the wall and slammed through the boards like a red-furred wrecking ball. They ran from the barn and into the night, knowing it would only be a matter of minutes before the creatures outside the radius of Dylan's blast came swarming towards them with tenfold numbers. As Barb waded through the black waters, she felt Bill's glowing red gaze upon her. What? She said, as she breathlessly trudged through the mire. I told you. He seemed like a pretty cool guy. The thick, reaching tentacles of the transfigured tree limbs had grown still and stunned from the spell which had left Dylan weak and struggling to keep pace with his companions. He had sighed with relief when they had finally came to higher ground and had almost shouted with joy when the forest finally began to clear and they arrived at what appeared to be a hill rising up from the swamp. As they climbed, they became aware of the bareness of the ground and a fiery red glow in the far distance where it was apparent a reactor was burning its way deep into the earth. They could feel the oppressive radioactive heat as smoke billowed only a mile away from a pit which had swallowed half of the town of Boot Heel. The landscape was charred and filled with particles of ash, which filled the air like gray snow, forcing them to hurriedly wrap their faces in cloth in order to breathe at all in the dismal radiated cloud. Their clothing was beginning to smoke and set aflame as their skin blistered in the waves of scorching radiation ebbing from the gigantic, crater-like hole. Sheldon whimpered as his fur began to curl and burn painfully. Rodney guided them off to a side road away from the pit and into a countryside desolate and lifeless. Everywhere there were signs of lost life in the form of bones, both animal and human, strewn everywhere the eye could see for miles. They had crossed many such locations and knew that no normal human could have survived anywhere nearby. In the darkness, they continued in a gradual upward climb, and they could see the large stone wall, which they recognized as the marker of the healing clinic and compound. I can breathe again, guys, said Bill as he removed the linen from his mouth and stopped momentarily to survey the field around them. Hey, is that grass? He asked, as he stopped and ran his large hand over what was indeed grass growing on the wayside of the road. Overhead, the clouds of the storm were cleared, and the moon shone bright and full, as if overhanging the compound like the star of Bethlehem over Christ's manger. That's not possible, Barb said as her eyes focused on the moonlight. But aren't those trees? Dylan was pointing ahead at what looked to be maple trees standing alive and covered in autumn foliage. We've seen it at the other compound near reactors, Rodney explained. It's sacred ground. Yeah, but only after we set off the transformation. We've never been here, dude. There shouldn't be any shamanic energy to protect the place. Bill was dumbfounded but smiling as he approached the first true tree that he had seen in a week. As they drew closer, the trees became thickly shrouded in rich moss and underbrush. Dylan stopped them and pointed into the woods encompassing the wall. There were forms moving in the bushes with silent ease around them, and occasionally they were witness to unsettling golden glints of light reflecting the rays of the moon. Sheldon was looking around nervously as if one of his worst dog nightmares was coming true. "What is out there?" Barb asked as her hand rested instinctually on the grip of her revolver. "They're not attacking, so let them be," Bill answered as they stood before the great iron gates of the clinic. He reached forward and grabbed the chained bars and shook them only to find them sealed by heavy padlocks. All four leapt back in unison as a snarling creature appeared from the shadows on the other side of the gate and hit the bars with incredible force. It issued a cry reminiscent of a mountain lion as it bared long, gleaming white teeth and reached between the bars with razor-like extended claws. Its eyes flashed with an unnatural gold as it swiped at them warningly. "What the hell?" Rodney exclaimed as he carefully leaned forward to study their attacker, only to jump back again as another emerged from the darkness and reenacted the other's greeting. "They're cats," Bill said with awe as his ears switched from side to side atop the singed hair of his head. "And they're fracking everywhere." They looked around with dawning apprehension as dozens of gleaming eyes shone from the bushes around them. "I know they're cats," Barb said, drawing her gun. "I mean, like kitty cats. Look." Bill was shining his flashlight at the two creatures on the other side of the gate, and to their shock they realized that indeed the monsters were in fact two striped gray house cats grown to the size of panthers. They looked at each other with shared confusion until they were pulled out of their dumbfounded state by a voice calling from within the compound walls. "Who is it? Who's out there?" The shrill, high-pitched voice came as the beam from a flashlight cut through the darkness. "Fluffy! Mr. Tinkles! Get back so I can see, damn it!" "Fluffy?" Bill whispered. "Mr. Tinkles," Rodney added. The light was now trained on them as a hunched shadow shuffled closer behind the visible barrel of a shotgun. Miss Shaden?" Dylan called out as he shaded his eyes with his blistered hand. "Who wants to know?" the crackly old voice answered from some 10 feet before them. "We're here to help you," Dylan answered, somewhat baffled as to how to proceed. "Really? What the hell are you?" she replied, shining the beam at Rodney and Bill, who grimaced and tried their best to smile innocently, a difficult prospect with mouths full of sharp fangs. "Dogs," she stated flatly. Wolves, actually," Rodney corrected. "Whatever," she said with a disappointed tone as she waved the double barrels of her weapon from one to the other. They could now see that she was in fact a very small woman dressed in bib overalls and tall rubber wading boots. The curly mass of gray hair on her head was covered in a wide-brimmed straw hat like any elderly woman might wear while working on their garden. "Oh, so you're here to help me, huh? With all the crazy things running around out here, how am I supposed to know you're the good ones?" Before they could answer, her head suddenly jerked to one side as if someone was shouting at her. "I know, goddammit, but look at him!" she shouted to no one in particular. "I don't care what he told you. I'm not just letting in some wandering dog people from God knows where." She once more seemed to be listening to some invisible, inaudible speaker. The four looked at each other silently, communicating that perhaps the old woman had lost her mind. "Oh, that's comforting. Yes, you've taken care of me so far, but look at them. They might eat me or something." "Yes, I would think the same thing about you, but that still don't mean I can trust them." She finally bowed her head, clenched her fists as she gripped her flashlight and gun tightly. "Oh, okay. I suppose if they were evil, they couldn't get this close. But I still think we should be careful." Her voice was quieting as her body seemed to relax, as if whatever was being said to her was calming. "All right, but just the girl." "Why?" "Because I don't trust men, you know that." She looked at them uneasily as she reached in her pocket, withdrew a keychain laden with a dozen keys of various shapes and sizes. Setting her gun against the wall, she began to cautiously undo the padlocks, and then, after pulling down the heavy chains, opened the gate only slightly. "Come on, Missy. But just you. The others can wait." Barb looked at the others with a nervous shrug as she entered. The old woman then hastily closed the gate, and wrapping the chain around the bars again snapped the lock back on. Barb watched as the woman snatched up her shotgun and once more pointing it at her barked, "Get going, girl. I don't have all morning. Barb began walking up the drive, watching the enormous feline guards with anxious worry as they took their place at the old woman's side like faithful pets. That damn cat's gonna get killed, Maud mumbled to herself as Barb realized there were dozens of overgrown cats watching from the courtyard, all who seemed like the first two to be larger variations of everyday tabbies, Persians, and Siamese. If you don't mind me asking, ma'am, what cat? Barb said, careful not to upset the gun-wielding senior. I do mind you asking, Missy. I'll ask the questions. First of all, who sent you? Vince Burns was the man who told us about you, ma'am, Barb answered, trying to sound as polite and reasonable as she could under the circumstances. The accountant? He's still alive? Yes, ma'am. He received some kind of message from you in a trance? He heard that, eh? I guess he wasn't as worthless as I thought. I didn't know if there were any psychics left out there, but no harm in trying. He said that it had something to do with the storm. Storm, eh? It's a vortex. A vortex? Barb stopped and turned to face Maud. Yes, a vortex. Maud was obviously irritated at having to explain herself. Something has crossed spheres. It was that goddamned witch man that killed Angel I'd lay money. Andrew Love? Barb said, turning from the path towards an open door, which Maud gestured with the barrel of her gun. Yeah, that wicked devil. I hope he rots wherever he went. So you think the storm is caused by him? Him? The Shadow Walker? Or both? How do you know it's a vortex? Barb asked, once more ignoring the old woman's no-questions policy as they entered into a small utility room lit by an oil lamp. Barb watched as she placed the gun on a workbench strewn with tools and, careful not to disturb her fine gray hair, removed her straw hat. In the light, Barb could see that Maud Shaden was indeed ancient, and probably well beyond her 80th year. I know it's a vortex because he told me. Maud snapped at her, waving a gnarled, frail finger angrily. Who, ma'am? Who told you? Doomcat! That's who, Maud said, as if Barb should already know. I'm going to tell her if you would just shut up, Maud said once more over her shoulder with frustration. I have to tell her the whole story or she won't understand. Barb stared at the old woman with more curiosity than fear as she was led through a small pantry into the kitchen, which originally had probably been used as the cafeteria for the clinic. Apparently, Maud was using the clinic as her living quarters instead of the compound. Miss Shaden, why aren't you living in the compound? Barb asked softly as the woman shuffled around the counter making coffee. Barb noticed that several appliances had their digital displays lit, and she guessed that the room did actually have electricity. There's no room? Maud answered as she poured careful heaps of rich, wonderful-smelling coffee into a filter. Why is that, Miss Shaden? Call me Maud, sweetie, she said, her voice now sounding much more pleasant, as if she were warming to Barb. Because of all the animals, Maud answered with a strange smile. Barb was suddenly stricken with wonder at the thought of how many animals it would take to fill the massive space of an entire compound. But how? Barb could not comprehend how so many could have ended up at one place. My dear, she began as the coffee maker began coughing and gurgling in the silence. I had them all brought here before the end came. How did you have enough time? Well, I knew it was coming, even before Jessie called me. Doomcat told me, honey. And thank God I listened. Barb gazed speechless into the woman's laughing hazel eyes. I suppose you'll want to be meeting him then, Maud said as she poured steaming black liquid into a small white mug which read, My best friend is A, followed by a picture of a Himalayan that seemed smiling on the side. I hadn't really thought about it, ma'am, Barb answered as she tried to assimilate what she was hearing. I mean, what is a Doomcat? That's just what I call him. I think his name used to be Christophorus or something or other. I didn't really know. I've never been good with foreign names. All I can say is that I'm glad he knew English. You said he used to be called Christophorus. Is he dead? Sort of. But anybody who read the Book of the Skull knows that that's just semantics. Maybe I should tell you more before you go into that compound. I just assumed, since all of y'all touched, that you would be used to these kind of things. Maud led Barb through a swing door into a spacious cafeteria, sat at a small table in front of the window. Reaching in her pocket, she withdrew a box of matches and lit a melted candle in the middle of the table. I'd turn the lights on for you, dear, but I haven't changed the batteries from my power supply in daylight, and I haven't had much time in the past few months, so I'm trying to conserve power. Barb sat down across from the old woman and once more smelled the heavenly aroma drifting from the cat mug. Dear, would you like some coffee? I haven't seen another person in so long, I've pretty much lost my manners. That would be great, Barb said, smiling while trying to hide the wrong keenness which she feared the woman might find frightening. She waited patiently as Maud stood and went back to the kitchen before returning with another best friend mug with a picture of the Maine Coon on the side. Do you like cats? Maud asked casually as Barb sipped the delicious, bitter French roast. Oh yeah, I love them. I had a little Angora for years when I was a kid. That's good. Do you like Maine Coons? That's the really big ones, right? She said, glancing at the picture to confirm her guess of its breed. Lord, yes. As big as a bobcat sometimes. I only ask because Doomcat was a Maine Coon to start with. God only knows how a foreigner got hold of one, but he says he had his specially imported since he likes them so much. Barb shook her head slowly to indicate she didn't know what Maud was talking about. Oh, I must sound like a Looney Tune rambling on and not explaining myself. Have you read the book, dear? Yeah, I got it on file right here, Barb said, taking her communicator from her bag and placing it on the table. Oh, that's one of those communicator doomer dodges that Ryan showed me. He showed me all the little things it does and put it in that secret room at the compound. He wrote down the code to get in it for me, and I went and lost it somewhere. Lord knows those boys tried, but I'm just too old for all that technology. Hell, I was just learning how to order things on the internet when the world fell apart. I got these mugs, though, before everything ended. Maud was smiling wistfully as she gazed out the window. Then, looking startled, she looked back at Barb. You are a pretty young thing. I bet you're glad you didn't end up looking like your boyfriends out there. Barb almost choked on her coffee at the last statement. They're definitely not my boyfriends, and the short one is my brother. Oh, that's lovely that you still have family. I never had any family since my mom died back in 1994. I was married twice. First time to a lovely boy from Florida who died working on an oil rig, and the second time to a no-good bastard who just wanted my money. I should have known he was lying when he said he loved cats, but didn't own one. So, did you have a lot of money? Bob asked, trying to be polite and make conversation despite her gnawing curiosity concerning the Doom Cat. Are you kidding me? I've been loaded since the day I was born. My daddy was the richest hog farmer in the state. Hell, he revolutionized the whole industry. He created the first clean hog facility in American history. Can you imagine a hog farm that doesn't smell, doesn't pollute the groundwater in the surrounding areas? He stopped using steroids, started raising them on feed that produced less fat in the animal. Shaden Pork Associates, Barb remembered, learning about the company in history class. The pro-animal groups were on the verge of destroying the entire industry until he designed the first environmentally safe hog farm. They say that he made pork healthy. Maud burst forth laughing. Oh, you're a smart one, aren't you? Barb smiled back, forgetting momentarily the unnerving effect of her fangs. Lord, girl, do you got some teeth? Mine aren't even real, the old woman exclaimed as she popped her dentures out and held them in her hand on display for Barb, who began laughing uncontrollably. After a moment, she caught her breath as Maud placed her teeth back in and took 2 loud swallows of her coffee. Well, I should really tell you about Doomcat now. Honestly, I don't know how to start. It was back in 2021, and I was running this cuckoo's nest. They all thought I was crazy. Maybe they were right. If it hadn't been for that sweet young woman, Angel Love, none of it would ever have been possible. The guild was all in an uproar because I was using the clinic to treat animals as well as people. And everybody but Angel and the Rose Boys was calling for me to be dismissed. I told them all to kiss my ass because I was using my own money to fund it half the time, but they all claimed that no one would come to a clinic for help when there was a dog being vaccinated in the next room. I told them that people who really need help don't care where they get it, especially poor people, and the South has never had a shortage of those. Thankfully, Angel was the one calling the shots. And when I said I wanted to open the emergency compound and use it as an animal sanctuary back in 2020, she never said a word against it. After I met Doomcat, I was damn glad I did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Cats have been following me around since before I could piss on a bowl. And when I was still learning how to talk myself, I already started to talk to them in my head. Now, not normal everyday conversations, mind you, but I knew what they wanted when they wanted it, and I knew what bothered them when they were upset. Now, up north, they called me a feline behavioral therapist, but down here in Alabama, they called me a cat doctor. I studied hard, and I got my degree in veterinary science so I could practice legally, and I started opening clinics before Angel Love was even a schoolgirl. I was already an old woman when I got a call to be Angel's show, and that's where I met her for the first time. I thought at first I was going to be a big old joke, and they were going to make fun of me on TV, but when those 2 black boys showed up, I kind of got suspicious that there was more to it than that. They were fine boys, the Rose brothers, respectful and kind-hearted. My cats just loved them. They took me on a plane to Los Angeles where they filmed and put me up in a really nice hotel. They told me that Angel wanted to take me out to dinner and asked where I'd like to eat. I told him anywhere was okay, but I was partial to Happy Clown's Burger Castle since the food was soft and I could chew it easy. I never thought that I would be sitting in a booth at Happy Clown's with a TV celebrity. But there she was, wolfing down French fries and greasy cheeseburgers. Lord, that woman liked to eat. So she talked about the show and asked me all kinds of questions about my life. About halfway through, she said, "Maud, you're a psychic, aren't you?" Well, I just looked at her like, she's called me a voodoo woman. I started to get up and walk out when she laughed and said it was okay because she was too. You'll never know what it was like to live an entire lifetime knowing something about yourself and never being able to talk to anybody about it. I sat back down. She ordered some sundaes, and we spent 2 hours sitting there talking. She was such a good person, but all of them were. It broke my heart when she died. I think I knew then that the world was ending, because some bastard had been born evil enough to kill my sweet Angel. I could barely carry on after that. I had girls here helping me run the clinic, but they still needed me, and I was just in no shape to do it. I was holed up in my house like the old lady I was finally feeling like I was. Hell, I even got the bottle out a couple of times. Well, more than a couple of times. I started drinking like I hadn't since I caught my second husband embezzling from the clinics. That was when Doomcat showed up, and everything changed. Now, believe me when I say that cats are some of the most intuitive creatures you will ever meet. A cat is always playing a game of cards in the world, And even though they keep their hands close, you can bet they know what everyone else is holding. Now, you'll always hear these stories about how selfish cats are, and how some old woman died alone in her apartment and cats ate her. But if you were locked alone with no food, how long would it be before you started looking at your pets as a meal? And when was the last time you ever heard of a cat eating another cat? It happens, but not nearly as much as it does with people. Cats are arrogant and territorial, but I don't think they don't love. A cat sees the universe in a way that is impossible for us to understand, and their rules are completely different. A reasoning, thinking human being is an emotional, impulsive mess when compared to the caution and the wisdom of the dumbest cat. I had been sitting alone in my kitchen, watching reruns of The Golden Girls, when I heard a scratching at my door. And I thought it was one of my own when I went to open it, but instead, there was the biggest, raggediest old Maine Coon I have ever seen. He was just sitting there on my steps, staring at me with these big golden eyes, as if he was saying, "I heard you like cats." I didn't even let him in. He just sauntered into the kitchen, planted himself at the bowls, and started eating like he had received an engraved invitation. All my other cats were staring at him like they were scared shitless, and I didn't blame them one little bit. When he was done, he jumped up on the table and laid down and watched TV with me. I have to admit that I liked him right off of the bat, and that is until he started talking to me. Now, I told you that I have always known what cats want, but this was different. I could hear a voice talking like a person. I'd be in the bathroom taking a shit, and I think I heard someone in the house. Then I'd open the door, and that old Maine Coon would be standing outside the door staring at me. I started to think I was losing my marbles, but the voice started to get clearer, and I could make out things it was saying. I'd give him some water, and I'd hear a voice as clear as day say, "Bourbon." And I said, "Look here, you crazy old cat. I'm not giving no feline alcohol." And he just started meowing and throwing a fit. And then one night I woke up, and there he was, laying on the bed staring. When I fell back asleep, I had a dream that I'll never forget. I dreamed that I was sitting in the pew of a big Catholic church, and a handsome young priest was sitting there beside me, and he was smiling kindly and had his hand on mine like he was counseling me. And he started talking, and I knew for sure that his voice was familiar. "Maud," he said with a funny accent. "My name is Father Christophorus Andres, and you do not know me, but I am a friend. Do you know the name of Cho Fan Yoon?" I nodded, thinking of the Asian man that had taken up with Angel before the murder. I met him in Amsterdam before he died. He had come into contact with a very powerful spirit, a tiger spirit, which gave him special powers. He was on his way to confront Angel Love's murderer when I met him. He blessed many of us in the following days so that we could help when a tragedy occurred. He told me about you and many other people in the guild, but the tragedy was beginning even as we tried to contact the organization. I was speaking out against a computer game. I knew the one he was talking about. When I was murdered in my apartment, my people who worked for Angel's killer, I spoke with Cho's spirit before he departed this realm, and he gave me very important information. I knew I needed to act so that this knowledge would not be lost. I knew that there were people who could speak with the dead, but I had no clue how to reach them. Cho had mentioned you because of your relationship with cats, and that was when I formulated a very desperate plan. Because I was touched by the spirit of the tiger, I found that I could enter the body of my house cat, Leopold. This is the cat which you have taken into your home. He is the vessel in which I reside. I am telling you this because you do not have much time. A great evil is descending on this world, and you must save yourself so that we can carry out our mission. This knowledge must be preserved, and I need your help to do it." And that was when I woke up, and sure enough, that cat was right there. "Maud, what was the important information?" Barb felt a cold chill at the expression on Maud's face, a grim mixture of fear and sorrow. "You see, Cho was passing on to another sphere and knew he would forget, so he had to pass it to somebody," Maud said, stalling. "Chris wanted to tell the guild, but didn't even know where or how to start, especially since he knew no one would believe him. Maud, please tell me." Barb was almost shaking now with frustration. "Dear, it's all so hard to understand, but you have to remember that Arkip Zulkin was a very powerful medium, and she wanted people to know the things that she had learned. Maud, you've got to tell me." Barb was gripping the table so hard that her claws were scratching the surface. The book is a fake, dear. Well, partly. Everything in it is true. But there never was a skull. They never even brought that man's body back from Siberia. Chris was rescued in cat form from the apartment by one of the members of his group. He could communicate with them because they were all touched, and he had them research what Cho's spirit had said before it departed. The masked hat of family was all mediums and psychics, but none of them were ever in contact with their father after his death. The entire thing about the skull was a hoax to help popularize the book after Afanasi and Arkip published it. But my brother saw the skull. The skull is what saved us and guided us. Barb was aghast with the thought of what this meant. Angel saw it too. That's what we can't figure out. If there never was a skull, then what was everyone talking to? Maud, we've got to let the guys in. I can't handle this by myself. Yes, dear, I know. I'll let them in, and we'll all go out to the compound and meet Dune Cat. Bill, Rodney, Dylan, and Sheldon sat huddled in darkness with their backs to the wall of the compound. A small fire burning before them as they ate a meal of jerky and canned beans. Their conversation had waned as their concern for Barb grew. It was from a sullen silence that they were suddenly startled by the familiar beep of Bill's communicator. Thinking at first it was Barbara, Bill answered only to find a strange female face gazing at him from the screen. He immediately noted a certain animalistic quality to her features reminiscent of the way Crawler had appeared, but with a much slighter mutation. Are you one of the Wolf Boys? She said with the directness of someone attending to an annoying chore. Yeah, he stammered, sitting up and staring with stunned curiosity. I am Nasher, an associate of Crawler and servant of the Lord behind the walls. I am contacting you at the behest of Crawler to inform you that he has witnessed a migration of the spirit dead towards your general vicinity. That is all. Be well. With that, she was gone, and the screen went blank. Seriously, don't talk my ear off, Bill said to the empty screen. That can't be a good sign, Rodney commented as Dylan looked up at the first stars he had seen in days. So, they are really all around us, and we just can't see them, he said quietly as he tried to imagine what Crawler was witnessing. Not all of them, but the ones who can't accept their new state are, apparently, Bill answered as he contemplated the meaning of paranormal migration. What if they're not coming here by choice? Dylan proposed solemnly. What do you mean? Rodney was always fascinated when the gears in Dylan's head began turning. Dylan had the ability to view situations with a strange abstractness that was often chilling. I mean, what if they're being drawn here despite themselves? What do we really know about that storm? I think old Miss Shaden knows more about it than we think, Bill said as he saw the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness as two shapes came towards them. Sheldon's ears perked up and his tail wagged excitedly as Barb rushed to the gate. "Guys, there is some serious weird stuff that you need to hear," she said as she waited for Ron to catch up and unlock the gate. "Yeah, well, we just got a message that all the ghosts are all going south for the winter," Bill said, standing and kicking dirt on the fire. They studied her response and found her unsurprised.